plastics.
This is the first episode of this podcast, but it's not technically the beginning of the Plastics brand. Plastics was something I started years ago, at a time in my life when I was feeling particularly disaffected by a shift in values I sensed was happening around me, though I don't think I fully understood it at the time. In its original form, Plastics was mostly just an outlet for me to complain about things. This was around 2018. I was running a startup at the time, which meant I was around a lot of tech people, and I was starting to feel like there was something wrong with the way a lot of those people saw the world. The things that made them excited and motivated them to come to work every day did not seem to have the same effect on me. They all seemed to think that applying technology to literally anything was in itself the definition of progress, and that making something more efficient necessarily made it better, and that aspiring to this type of progress was unquestionably the goal of our existence. It's not that I think technology is fundamentally bad. I'm not a Luddite. I appreciate antibiotics and plumbing. I studied electrical engineering in college thanks to an interest in audio tech that has continued through to today. It's just that anytime something is made out to be self-justifying, meaning when we let ourselves believe that this narrow definition of progress, like the concept of goodness itself, does not need to be defended or justified in order to be valid, it falls into the same camp as other things that require blind faith, like religion. Faith in and worship of this type of progress is as much a religion as Christianity or Islam is, and I found it incredibly annoying that anytime I expressed even a modicum of doubt about whether certain applications of tech were actually making anyone's life better, people treated it like blasphemy. I never liked the idea of halting the investigation at some kind of self-justifying progress, especially since the things that were passing for progress at the time were often so completely brainless. I think there's since been a correction as the ways in which technology can be used to our detriment, both intentionally and unintentionally, have started to be discussed more publicly. But back then, all you really had to do was take some real-world thing and then make an app for it, and you got to collect your high fives for making the world a better place. Plastics, in its original form, was basically just an outlet for me to complain about this sort of behavior. The only video I ever posted to our YouTube was a tongue-in-cheek ad for a fake code academy that teaches people how to think like the people that were driving me crazy at the time, the people that were thinking this way. And I had a Twitter account I used as basically a clone of another account, which I was a big fan of, called Shitty Future, which was and still is a hilarious aggregation of all the ways in which the pursuit of progress through technology was having cringeworthy effects that somehow a large portion of society didn't seem to have a problem with. As of today, the pinned post on Shitty Future's Twitter is a video of 5 touchscreens arranged in the shape of a cross, and a man thoughtfully swiping various historical crucifixes onto those screens and then contemplating them, as if there was something deeply meaningful about what he was doing. Bluetooth refrigerators, restaurants that make you download an app to order, technology for the sake of technology. There was and still is a strong argument to be made that a lot of it not only doesn't make the world a better place, but that it actively makes our lives worse. I recently saw a discussion about how the printer manufacturer Brother came to be the de facto industry leader simply by being the only one that didn't succumb to the cult of progress, and therefore was able to avoid the degradation that comes with continuously adding useless novelty items to their products. This was an insight for me, that for many people, tech has such a cult-like effect on them that they aren't able to recognize the absurdity of a bunch of people sitting in a booth at a restaurant waiting for an app to download, instead of just talking to each other. That's not being old-fashioned, that's just being lucid enough to recognize that one of these systems is clearly superior to the other. Fortunately, I think we've moved on somewhat from that era. It's been a while since I've seen some wannabe Steve Jobs type give a keynote presentation in which they pulled their phone out of their pocket so they could point to it and tell me about how the smartphone is a revolution, as if they were the first to realize it. And the headlines about major tech companies like Facebook and Google, which once waxed poetic about the techno-utopian future we were undoubtedly headed for, have become much more ominous over the years, as the conversation has turned to algorithms and political manipulation and psychological impact. However, while I do believe that our view of technology is less of a slapstick comedy than it once was, I don't believe we are any less enraptured by the cult of progress than we ever were. It's just that our preoccupation du jour has changed. Where once it was social networks and killer apps and blockchain that were held up as the incontrovertible solution to all of society's woes, it's now AI and LLMs. To be clear, I'm not suggesting that I think these technologies are insignificant or that I think they're an unimportant fad. What I'm skeptical of is that they will in some way lead to people living better lives, in any way other than financially and for a small handful of people. And even if these technologies are indeed inevitable, and I do think that some of them likely are, that doesn't mean that we have to go around pretending like they're always a good thing. I called this brand Plastics back in the day because plastics seemed to encapsulate the feeling of whatever kind of world it was that we were building. Everything was just a means to an end. Beauty was no longer important. Nothing was good enough that it had the right to last. Nothing lasted long enough to acquire meaning and become part of a culture. In both the physical world of objects and in the patterns of human interaction, things were both literally and figuratively becoming more plastic and losing their sense of permanence and meaning. There's a philosopher I like called Byung-Chul Han, I hope I'm saying his name right, who once said in an interview, quote, "I don't know if people who spend all their time looking at smartphones still have or need objects that are close to their heart. Objects are receding into the background of our attention. The current hyperinflation of objects, which has led to their explosive proliferation, only highlights our increasing indifference towards them. They are almost stillborn." End quote. A hyperinflation of objects. It seems that the fantasy behind the idea of progress is that we are headed towards some kind of a singularity in which abundance is fully realized and where everyone's desires are fulfilled the very moment they arise. But that vision doesn't seem to take into consideration the fact that living a good life might not have anything to do with that. And in fact, I'm prepared to make the case that it doesn't. And if I'm correct, then it poses the question, what exactly is all this for? This is a question we've only just recently, in the scheme of things, been asked to answer. Prior to the advent of humanism, when we still had God and heaven and all that stuff, the idea of salvation floating around above us, the question of what makes for a good life didn't even come into play, because the point of life wasn't happiness or fulfillment or living well. It was to live in accordance with the will of God. Faced with questions of meaning, we basically got to shrug, point at God, and say, I don't know, ask him, he's in charge. Humanists, on the other hand, have a heavier burden, because if the purpose of life is not to serve a God, but to seek fulfillment in the act of living, then the question of whether or not we are living correctly is one we must continuously answer. There is no rule book for how to live well. And even though humanism is the dominant Western ideology of the 21st century, it feels as though we haven't quite gotten the hang of it. We know we're supposed to live well, but we're still experimenting with how it's actually done. The fact that society seems to have landed on a definition of progress based on a combination of instant fulfillment of all desires and the complete eradication of anything unpleasant does a good job of making that case. So what does it mean to live well? Does it have something to do with fulfilling our desires? Are the people who get exactly what they want the happiest or the most content with their lives? And if not, why have we built a whole society around making everything as instantly available as possible? Or perhaps living well isn't necessarily about fulfilling the desires so much as it's about avoiding the unpleasantness and inconvenience of acquiring that fulfillment. Is a fulfilling life simply one where traffic jams and long-distance travel are replaced with teleportation devices, and gardening consists of fully grown plants instantly appearing in the dirt, and dinner time is reduced to little bits of food appearing on the table the moment we experience so much as an inkling of hunger? As I say this, I'm already hearing the disgruntled comments of people who, for various reasons, insist that these things would indeed lead to good living. But these people are not considering the deeper consequences of us integrating these types of things into society. Yes, seeds that instantly turn into mature plants would be cool, but what makes them cool is that they're novel. Once that novelty has worn off, and that would happen quickly, all we've really done is eliminate meaning. What does a century-old tree mean when it becomes instantly replaceable? Gardening is an enormously popular global practice. What happens to gardening when growing tomatoes no longer happens over the course of a season, but in an instant? Or what about travel? Our platitudes tell us it's about the journey, not the destination. Yet we work tirelessly to eliminate that journey. We fantasize about hyperloops and the idea that we could simply pop into a different country for lunch. But is it not the very fact that these places are very far away that makes them meaningful to us? It used to be that traveling meant committing months or even years to a slow, cumbersome, and unpredictable journey. But the magic of the experience, the things that made it memorable, and the things that made the destination itself feel so glorious, lay precisely in that unpredictability. Contrast that against the as fast as possible version of travel we have today. With the exception of the case where the plane straight up crashes, there's no such thing as a memorable flight. They're all identical. And of course, that's by design, because that's what makes it possible to quickly and safely hop between continents for a quick business trip or a weekend getaway. To be clear, I'm not suggesting we'd all be better off if we went back to traveling by boat and occasionally getting attacked by pirates along the way. Whenever I make points like this, there's always some people who think I'm lost in some kind of Oregon Trail style fantasy, and that somehow no one has broken it to me that those guys all died of dysentery. All I'm saying is this: is it not at least worth considering the things we lose when we eliminate those journeys? When we work so hard to get everything we want the very moment the desire appears? And is it not at least worth considering the impact that that has on our ability to find meaning in our lives? There's a lot to talk about here, and we've only just begun to scratch the surface. To be perfectly honest, I never saw myself as the type of person to start a podcast. I owe a big thank you for that to my sister-in-law Sophie, who over the recent holidays helped me to discover the unique potential that this format has for investigating the kinds of ideas that are constantly evolving and too messy and too interrelated to cover in a single blog post or book. And while there's certainly no guarantee, I like to think there's potential to do here what I failed to do with my handful of cynical tweets and satirical videos from last time. And assuming I don't end up alongside the boatload of other podcasts that have failed to make it past the first 3 episodes, I hope we can create something meaningful here. Thanks for listening. If there ends up being a next time, I hope to see you there.